Hello, everyone. Welcome to July's Fireside Chats at Adiva. Today, we have a very interesting topic to discuss, which is how generative AI will transform the way we handle documentation as developers. Very exciting thing. Most of us are guilty of not spending or not investing enough time in documentation because, as we all know, whenever someone joins an organization, documentation is the main thing that we require to perform best and to collaborate. I mean, to avoid having to go after a lot of people to understand how things work. Yet when it comes to doing it, we'd rather spend the time elsewhere. So that's the reason why I have Zac with me here today. We are going to discuss all of this, the needs of documentation in development teams, how to save time and still have reliable documentation, what they do at Joggr, which is a product that enables developers to handle documentation in an easier and seamless way without taking too much of their time. Zac, I'll leave it to you and you'll definitely explain it better. Let's start with a quick introduction. Tell us about yourself, about Joggr, and we can continue the discussion from there.
Yeah, sounds good. So I'll start off with Joggr. I know you mentioned the developer productivity, which is something that people are really focused on right now. And that's what we're doing, is we're accelerating developer productivity, because every time your code changes, we automatically update your documentation and also generate new documentation for you. And that helps with that, like, A, we're not investing in documentation. We don't spend time there. We don't have to. Joggr will. And that's where I see a lot of the industry heading. As far as my background, I've spent the last 10 years in and around startups. I was formerly a director at FedEx for platform engineering and their AI ML wing. I've accidentally been a part of AI companies for the past 5 years. That's not my background, but I had some opportunities with startups to join early. So it's been a good experience.
Nice. What are the things that made you start Joggr? What were the pains in terms of documentation that you have faced? What are the challenges that you're aiming to help people overcome?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I was a director of platform engineering at FedEx. My co-founder was head of developer platform at a company called Clear. If you've ever flown, they're in a lot of the US based. I'm not sure if they're in Europe and other places, but it's a way to skip the line. We were both working directly with developers and found that developers we're working with had a lot of issues around knowledge sharing. It would pop up like, hey, the senior engineer spends half their day on Zoom calls explaining how something works, or they're constantly answering Slack questions. Hey, how does this work? How does this work? How does this work? They actually can't code. He actually had a developer quit and leave the company because they could not spend enough time actually investing in their work. They were spending more time helping other people, which is important, but when you're not able to deliver software as an engineer, that's super frustrating. And that's been a repetitive thing I've seen throughout my whole career. And we quit our jobs really with a problem statement more than a solution. Spoke to about 100 developers and developed Joggr in the last 6 to 8 months. So
yes. What happens in the background? Like, how do you mentioned whenever your code changes, Joggr updates your documentation. Do you rely on how the code is written? Do we need to write proper code, understandable code, so that you can generate documentation from it? Do we need to write documentation blocks within the code? Can we dig more into that part of the process?
Yeah, so bring your code as it is. Bad code, good code. Most code is some level of spaghetti to a certain degree, which is fine. But I think that's kind of the point, is documentation helps with that. And what we're actually doing is listening to changes, and then we'll analyze that code using a lot of the LLMs and generative AI stuff that's on the market now to generate the documentation. That's based on Python, PHP, JavaScript. Java does not matter, whatever language you're using. I will say more obscure languages probably will have more difficult if you're using some very, I can't even think of one, but the top languages, you'll be probably fine.
And how do you ensure it will work with such a broad array of languages?
Yeah, so one of the important things we're doing initially is a human in the loop process for as far as labeling our data. So that's not only based on like a human saying accept, reject, which you'll see in a lot of the LLM type products, also behavior, because we're integrating directly with GitHub and all of our documentation is actually marked down within GitHub. So when we open a pull request to update documentation, if you accept it and merge it in, that's behavior we can use label data. If you make changes to documentation, we can look at how many changes you've made to that, determine accuracy, and that can determine the label we're going to use behind the scenes. So basically, we're able to label our data just the more our users use it.
Right. That makes sense. Can we just to understand how everything works more clearly, like use an example of some piece of code, let's say payments, like e-commerce website with multiple payment options. We're handling credit cards, Stripe is credit card, PayPal, other options within the code, regardless of how it's written, whether it's properly structured or coupled together. How does it work under the hood? What do you pull from that data that the developers have entered within the code to generate the documentation, and how?
Yeah, so we have access to GitHub. So every time your code is changing, those events are sent to us. We can then access the Git diff and look at existing documentation, update it. And in your example, if there was some kind of payment flow across multiple files, you made an update to that flow, we can then see that file attached to it. We can also see that that file might be importing other files and then make that connection there and then pull in those files to pass that to our models to pull back or to create that documentation. Just the big thing is for us is just being plugged in and being able to access that code, and then we can start going right away. And the more documentation you've generated with us, it's really a little bit easier for us to make decisions and generate better documentation.
Is it understanding business logic as well from the code, or is it mostly technical?
That's where I would say sort of. So the foundation models we're using behind the scenes are trained on the same data corpus that everyone has access to. So they have some level of knowledge, those models have some level of knowledge of the logic and can parse that. If you ever use like GitHub Copilot, those are similar products as far as the technology behind it. But it's not like a static analysis or an AST or something where we're actually looking at the if statements and the decision trees and all the logic. It's more looking at it from like a language perspective. So name a function get user, we can figure out, hey, that's probably associated to the user model that we already have access to. Using NLP, make those connections across the code base.
Right.
Like traditional static analysis type stuff that you might have used before a lot of these AI technologies came to the surface in the last couple of years. So I would say like sort of is the answer. One way to say sort of.
Yeah, it makes sense. So in terms of like data protection, how you use, what are the, like you're working with the code, you're connected to GitHub. What are the things that need to be considered over there from technical perspective? And now I'm talking also not only how Joggr works, but how someone else would approach working on similar product when it comes to generative AI. And I want to dig into the generative AI a bit more after. But what are the technical complexities, technical requirements in the background that need to be considered to implement a complex product like this one?
From like a security perspective or more just the technical?
Data security, other things that you need to, like, what are the things that you have had to do in the background to develop it? Of course, without digging into confidential information.
It's fine. So like from a high level, the data security model is probably not that different than most people have built throughout their careers, enterprise software. Like we get user tokens from GitHub because when you're committing a document to GitHub, it's as you, not as us. So we're committing on your behalf. So those are doubly encrypted. So they're encrypted at rest, but also we encrypt in the client and decrypt in the client. Just like the normal patterns you would see. As far as like accessing code, I think I've heard this objection from folks like, oh, I don't want to pass my code to OpenAI. I'm like, great. You store your code in GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket, you're already passing your code to an external cloud system. What's the difference? You're already passing it to Circle CI. what's the difference? So like to a certain degree, those people are already doing this. I think the big security concerns that have popped up around ChatGPT, OpenAI, are because when people have copy and pasted code directly into ChatGPT, that will be stored and used for training. So they've exposed internal data, secrets, IP. I think it was some chip manufacturer had an issue because they were building a PowerPoint and exposed a bunch of really sensitive IP. Like that's the kind of stuff that you shouldn't do. But since we're using the API, we've basically nullified all of that because their terms and conditions for like OpenAI, Vertex AI with Google, Anthropics, they're all different. They don't record that data because they want to work with Spotify or other large companies. So they're not going to record that. So that's like the security model in my mind from the generative AI piece. Otherwise, I think it's pretty standard model as far as encrypt at rest, encrypt in transit.
Does it learn from multiple users, or is it like, is my code only available for myself? Are you learning for the documentation from my code only when you send a pull request to us, or is it learning from everyone and then sending pull requests to specific people?
Yeah, so the foundation models from what we're doing do not learn. The fine tuning we do on top of it, which is our internal stuff, that is the quote unquote training. Like like the old school data, I say old school, it's like 3 years ago, but the data science machine learning training that people would have done with labeled data, like supervised learning, fine tuning models. And that's what we are doing. So we'll do that across our entire network. So the more companies and the more users we have, that improves our models overall. And we're developing certain models for like analyzing code, for generating documentation, for describing code, different fine tune. So there's like different aspects that we're going to do that we are doing over time. But that can be also at the enterprise level. So we've talked about if we're pretty much working with medium-sized companies. If we were to sign up a very large company, we might specifically train a model for them. That's something we haven't really talked about, but or talked about too much. That's something we are going to explore at some point.
Okay. So back to generative AI, like how does it all work with the example that so within the context of the documentation? So let's look at the example. How does it, like, you're using OpenAI in the background?
So if you're asking how LLMs work, like the neural nets, I don't think the people that built them know exactly how they work. It's more of
I know how it works.
They feed data to it, see the outputs, and then feed new data to it. That's kind of the LLM side. But if you look more at what we're doing, more the applied side, we have multiple different models we're using. We're fine-tuning our own models, and we're also using different prompts. If you've not heard the term prompt engineering, that's a whole new thing that's happening. It's basically about being able to write good prompts to tell the model to do something. And it's actually very interesting because the models themselves are naturally non-deterministic. But if you write good prompts and tweak things like the temperature on the model, when you're making the request, you can actually make it more deterministic, meaning you'll get the same response or a very similar response. So for your example, if there was I'll even use like a general example of like user authentication and authorization. So there's like an authorization hook or plugin or something, an authentication hook or plugin that's talking to like an auth0, all those different files. You want to create a how-to guide. You select, I want to look at this file, this file, this file, and this file. You say how to set up authorization, authentication on a route. And then you send that to us. What we'll then do is take those files, we'll get the data from GitHub, chop them up if we need to, send them to our models, get some new data, maybe transform it, take the prompt you did, inject it into a prompt that we have behind the scenes, send that to a model. We get back the different assets, build a document, and then we'll take that document and probably send it to a final model to review it and say, hey, with a prompt that's something naive, does this look good? Question mark. It's really naive prompt. Something like that, and it'll say yes or no. Yes, we return it to the user. No, we return it to the user and say, hey, this probably isn't right, but what do you think? Something like that. So it's not just a proxy to OpenAI. There's a lot of pieces you have to put together to get a product or an output that has high efficacy, because otherwise you're just going to get some crazy stuff sometimes. So it was like a good enough explanation, because I was trying to get all the flows and details to kind of lay out it's more than just a direct proxy to OpenAI.
Yeah, it was great. Definitely what I wanted to hear, because I was curious about how it works from your perspective, from the applied perspective, not the other complexity. So
yeah, I choose someone from Anthropic or OpenAI on the horn, and they can maybe dig in neural nets a bit. I think that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but
yeah. In terms of different technologies, the tech stack, programming languages, you mentioned that you support many. Are there any things that you need to do constantly to get up to speed with those, or is it mostly like relying on the OpenAI and the APIs that you're using for that part, and you're focusing only on properly arranging the documentation?
Yeah, so we're not currently doing any language specific fine tuning or training. We're relying on the foundation models, and we're focused more on the output of the documentation. So there is like some level of, we're not doing that yet, but I think as we get farther and farther along, we're hitting like the quote unquote ceiling of where we can get as far as efficacy. We need to jump that. We'll probably start to do some specific language training.
Right.
But right now, like just the outputs and outcomes we've seen, I'm not sure we're going to need it, especially with all the investment happening in LMs right now. Like there are LMs that are being dedicated specifically to code, and like Google has one that we're going to leverage. I want them to do that really well, so I can do the applied stuff on top. I see generative AI sort of as like cloud or something. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, you had to set up your own servers. You had to go do all that yourself. Now, no startup I've ever talked to is doing their set up their own servers, unless it's a very bespoke use case. So I see this as like a foundational tool in the engineering tool belt moving forward. So I don't like that specific training, et cetera. I'm going to hopefully outsource that to Google or AWS or whoever I'm working with.
That's an excellent point. My highlight of the conversation so far. So never reinvent the wheel. Let the people who are good at it do what they do best, and you do what you do best.
Yeah, I'll even take it a step farther. So I've talked to people about this. As though we are an applied AI company, we're solving a problem that's real. If AI didn't exist, we would still try to solve this problem. We would just use different technology. So I think a lot of companies or a lot of people are thinking, oh, there's this cool new toy, slap some paint on it, push it out, and people will use it. It's like, no, we talked to hundreds of developers to get to the point of, oh, this is the solution we want to build. This is the true problem they're facing. I would recommend anyone that's thinking about diving into AI, start with the problem, the real world problem you're trying to solve, and just use the tool that's best for it. You might find out good old fashioned logic solves the problem. You don't need AI. There's a lot of folks I think that are jumping on the bandwagon right now that aren't really solving a problem. So
yeah, that's true. It's a buzzword, and with all of the investments and everything, people think they need to have AI to be good. So yeah. Let's see what else we have. Like the future of Jogger, of developer documentation. You mentioned like working with enterprises, adapting to different scenarios moving forward. What are the things that you think like years ahead Jogger would need to face, and how do you envision approaching those?
Yeah, I can talk more generally because we have a thesis on where we believe knowledge sharing and knowledge management is heading. So like when I did the pitch earlier, like the description of what we're doing, I mentioned automatically updating documentation and generating the documentation. What I didn't mention is a piece that we believe is probably the future, which is auto-generating or generating documentation on the fly. I've been calling it JIT documentation. I'm an engineer, so I think of like just-in-time type processes. That's fine, but it's really, you ask a question, you get an answer based on some set of data. So if you picture a future world where pretend there's no documentation, but this machine, we'll say this like just AI machine, has access to all your source code, all of your pull requests, all of your Slack channels, all of your data at your enterprise. You then ask it a question. It can look at that data and send back an answer. And you've seen this with Google. They're starting to do this. With like you opt into the generative AI piece, you'll ask a question in Google, and it'll pop back an answer summarizing probably their own internal results they have. And that's where I think we're actually heading. And that's something we're going to do at Joggr, and people are super excited about. It's just we need to build out the initial documentation layer for us now. But in the future, yeah, I see this like JIT documentation being the norm, that people just ask a question to a thing, a bot, something, and get back their answer. So
yeah,
yeah,
it's the knowledge base.
Yeah, it's, as being a company that works in documentation, saying I don't believe documentation will exist in 10 years, at least not like it does, can seem strange, but I think we're positioned well to march into that era. I still think there will be documentation, but it'll be things like API documentation or things that are more concrete, looking at how you interface with something, not because you can't ask a question and get an answer, but because you just want to look at it and understand what can you do with this tool. But the like, how do I deploy to prod? How do I add a route? How do I set up authentication? Those are all questions that I believe can be answered by these AIs as we're moving forward.
Right.
So that's the future I think we're heading towards.
You know the saying, the best companies are the companies that disrupt themselves. So I guess you're headed the right way.
Yeah, that's the goal. We laughed about it because we thought like, oh, should we just do that now? But again, we went back to like focusing on the problem that people are facing today. And I think that's a learned behavior that's going to have to change with people, that we're going to have to plug in to existing workflows to start to change that behavior, to ask the bot. Don't ask Fred, your senior engineer, because Fred's super busy and can't answer 20 questions a day. So that's where I think we're heading. But again, I think it's going to take a little bit of time, but who knows? Like Google's moving really fast with their AI stuff. So we'll see.
Yeah, it might be very soon.
Yeah.
What are the things that people are using most? Like you're in beta right now.
Right.
Do you have?
Yeah. Well, close
do you
beta.
have?
Excuse me. I'm sorry. The New York traffic. Some cab driver's probably honking at someone, but yeah, we're in a closed beta right now. We will look to launch next year. We're keeping it around 20 enterprises we're working with, and we're hoping to launch early next year, late this year. It just really depends, because for us as founders, we want to be able to have that one-on-one personal touch. I'm meeting with every single user. Like, I don't care if we have 400 users, I'm going to get one-on-one time on a Zoom call with them to meet them, understand their pain points with the product, understand their pain points day to day. That's super critical to building out the early product. We're hoping to launch next year publicly to a wider group of people.
How was that for you, being an engineer? It's usually the hardest part, talking to people.
Well, so luckily I've been like an executive for the last 4 or 5 years. That's still coming. So I was forced to do like, here's a PowerPoint, present. I'm also kind of a social butterfly. I enjoy talking to people. So really just like, these are my people. These are engineers. This is not like I'm meeting with, I don't know, vending machine salespersons or something that's like very out of my realm and comfort zone. I can talk to them and know, hey, they know about JavaScript, or they know what the technologies I'm using. We can geek out for 10 minutes about whatever we're working on. So
nice.
Yeah.
What are the things they're mostly using Joggr to document? Like you mentioned, how to deploy, how to set the routes. What are those the common things it's used for right now? Or
yeah, it's if you look back, I stated earlier, like the problem people are facing today is they have to go look in the code to know how to do something or ask a question. to someone that wrote the code or super senior. It's solving those kind of problems. So like, how do I deploy? How do I add a route? How do I do this? Basically all the things you need to know to be productive in a code base. That's our sweet spot right now. We are doing some level of like Terraform module, API documentation, that kind of stuff. So we're working with a lot of platform teams, but that's not really like where we're focused right now. We will expand longer term. But I think again, it goes back to solving that core problem. And the core problem is those senior engineers are swamped with 20 questions, and those engineers that get onboarded or code transferred to them don't know how to work on it, and they have to go figure it out themselves. And that's not a place or world I want to live in. So,
if we have any questions from the audience, feel free to add them in the Q&A section, and we will address them now. Zac, is there anything that you think is interesting for the audience to hear that we haven't covered so far?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of applications for the LLMs or foundation models people don't realize, like actually transforming code. There's a company right now, they are, it's not transforming code, this is data extraction, where they're using LLMs to parse Word documents, like human written documents, into structured data or ASTs or something. Like that's the kind of things you can do that are not, they don't seem like, you think of like LLM, like, oh, it's a chatbot. Like, no, send JSON blob and say, transform it to HTML. It can do that. Or like it can do a lot of different things that you'd be surprised by. So there's a lot of applications we haven't realized. And there's a lot of also what I've been calling like LM stacking, or prompt stacking, where you stack different prompts on top of each other to basically get some outcome. So we're actually doing that, where we'll, like a how-to guide, we'll actually generate the steps as an array of like objects, get that back, and then inject it into a markdown document, and then have that document reviewed by another prompt via an LLM. So like there's a lot of things you can do in applications that I don't think a lot of folks have realized, because they just see it as a chatbot. And code is just written language in a logical format. It's still, we all use a keyboard, so it's like, it's not like it's stuff. Like we're not writing zeros and ones all day. This is like human readable code or human readable language. So I think there's a lot of applications that we've yet to see enter the market, enter in enterprises internally. So I'm excited to see how that goes.
Nice. Are there any resources that you'd like to share, or some, I don't know, sites that offer information of multiple apps of this sort?
As far as like training or like helping people get started?
Yeah, something like that. Or what are the possible, like, what's everything, there's, what are all of the things out there that you can use to do anything as engineer, that type of thing?
This is where I think,
or you'd like to see it as well.
the limits of your imagination. Maybe I could create a GitHub repo with a list of different ideas, but basically any problem you would have solved with code, can you solve it with the LM? Perfect example. I will take code, pass it over the API. This is me doing this with Postman. So this is like super like rigged together, duct tape and bubble gum, but it works. I'll pass my code over the API, and it'll generate unit tests for me, because I don't like writing unit tests, but I want my code unit tested. It'll spit out something that's like, oh, this is pretty close to what I want. Now I could use Copilot or something else to do that, but that's almost quicker for me now that I've been doing the integration with OpenAI so much. So like generating unit tests, generating documentation, you don't have to use Joggr. You can still try to do that over the API. I just think you're gonna have a rough time with the outputs as we have over the past 8 months. But anything you've done, like data transforming, ETLs, converting from one language to another. That's like, I've had to do that before, where hey, we're rewriting this in Kotlin from Java. Just pass it. I wouldn't use ChatGPT if it's internal IP, but do it over the API, or build a little HTML window and submit it. It'll shoot back the Kotlin, and it'll probably be like 95+% accurate, if not 100%. So any engineering stuff we've been doing, I think those foundation models could have an application. So.
And now a follow-up question to this: how do you see the role of the engineers in the future?
Yeah, so I know folks are, I'll use the word nervous, especially folks that are like content developers, like not engineers, but like people writing content, like journalists, etc. Even with that field, the journalists collect the data. They go out and they do different things. They have expertise. They know how things work. They can then use that to generate content and then edit the content. I do the same thing as engineers, is we're experts in software engineering. We're experts in the databases we're using, whatever we're doing, right? So like we can generate that code, do different prompts, etc., then edit it. And that's how we're going to fit. It's going to be like, I think it'll actually accelerate development for a lot of folks. And you'll have to do a lot less of the really boring stuff. Like real world example is I love JSON schema. If anyone out there knows what JSON schema is, I'm sure you know why. It's a really easy translation layer for data, but it is the most time-intensive, boring thing to write. I use Copilot locally. That thing has made my life so much easier. I think things like that, where like, you know what you want, just tell it, pops it out, you review it, instead of spending 20 minutes writing JSON, which is a waste of your time to a certain degree. You want to solve the problem for your user, not spend your time writing some JSON blog. So
True.
yeah, so I'm not scared.
And that had to be done that way in the past.
So I'm sorry, go ahead, Katrina.
I was just saying that had to be done manually in the past because there were no tools to write JSON in, and now that's solved. We are solving other problems. So I guess we're only going to see the role of developers evolving into doing more creative work, more problem solving,
right?
And then less of the bad stuff.
Yeah, an analogy I've used with developers is like, do you use a framework? Yeah, I use Spring Boot or I use Express. Okay, great. Do you use a database ORM? Yeah, I use this. So you're not writing vanilla SQL. You're not writing an entire routing layer yourself. You're using someone else's code to do that. But yeah, right. Are you out of a job? No, this is the same thing. This is like a tool in the tool belt for engineers. Now, like 30 years, 40 years from now, maybe like a product manager could type in something and it spits out an entire application. I don't know. That's so far out.
Or maybe it's not.
I think it is. These things are not as smart as people think they are. They're getting there. Like they're amazing compared to where they were 4 or 5 years ago. Like I said I've been accidentally part of AI for a while. I was using NLP to generate text 9-10 years ago with a company called Generative Science. That seemed like magic. And it's better than it was then, 100%. Like it's way faster. You don't have to train millions of records to get the data you want, but it's still not like the replace humans level thing. Like we still have to be in the loop. We still have to be involved to some level. Now I do think like content writers, if all you do is write content all day, I think you could struggle, or leverage AI to generate 4 times the amount of content you could have before. So I think it's how you see the tool in my mind.
Yeah.
I mean, like I was mentioning, I was coming from a farming family. There was a point when these tractors scared farmers because they wanted to use the horses for manure they could use in the fields, and no one uses a horse to farm really anymore. Everyone's using tractors. So like, I think it's just technology improves, jobs change, we adapt. So.
Excellent analogy.
I think the farming reference in there.
There's one question. Is there a filtering phase applied before data being fed into the model to prevent training models with wrong invalid inputs?
So if I play that back, basically asking to label data sets for fine tuning, like preventing bad data from getting the models. Here, I can
Maybe we can get some clarification in the chat. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the one difference between training, like supervised learning in the past, is it would take usually larger data sets. We've had success actually generating synthetic data. Also just looking at the data ourselves, like a couple hundred records can actually show a significant improvement as long as labeled. So you don't need to do the super in-depth, like thousands of records, because OpenAI is doing that for you on the other end, or Google is. They have huge teams doing that. But yeah, I think there is like some level where like the person doing the training needs to make sure it's not bad data, because your models, this has not changed. Your models are only as good as the data you pass it. You pass a bunch of crap data, you're going to have bad outputs. Does that answer the question? I don't know if they can respond or not.
Let's see if there's a follow-up. Feel free to add it in the chat. Do we have anything else from someone? Zac, something from you as a wrap-up?
Yeah, I think I'll end with, there's a lot of fear and unknown and a lot of this around AI, machine learning. I would say don't be fearful of it. Don't be scared of it. Go use it. Go try it. Go try to integrate it into your product if it makes sense. I think it's something that's going to help us overall. And there are some smart people, like I know OpenAI just set up a rogue AI team. Like there's some smart people thinking about the really scary problems around AI. But as far as like right now, what we have access to, I would say go out, use it, try to find an applied use case, and don't be scared to dip your toe into the water. The beauty of the current setup is AI is available, or ML AI is available over API. It is not some giant thing you have to train and set up a Kubernetes cluster and GPUs and all this kind of stuff you used to have to do. It is super accessible. So go access it, go use it, because if you don't, someone probably will, and they'll get ahead of you. So that's like the thing I think I want to wrap up on is go use these technologies, go leverage them, go learn. That's how we'll continue to improve as an industry, as a society, etc. So
great. Thank you. That was an amazing way to finish up the conversation. I really enjoyed learning more about Jogger, the way you apply AI, the way we can all do things with it. So yeah, thank you again for accepting the invite to join us. And this will be out very soon on all of our channels.
I appreciate it. It's been a joy. So thank you so much to everyone for attending, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Ciao. Bye.
Ciao.